welcome to the first Fireside chat on energy and sense making. Officially, my name is Poettschacher. I co-founded Energies United. We're a boutique agency and we focus on new ways to communicate energy literacy, whatever that means. So today I'm here and very much looking forward to a conversation between Mette and Mitchell Thomashow. And I'd like to start with a very brief introduction statement from both of you about what your role is, what your background is, and maybe where you're located right now. Mette, why don't you start?
Thank you, Eric. So I guess to start from the end, where am I located? I'm located in Scotland. I live in Edinburgh, and I'm a reader of social anthropology at University of St. Andrews. I'm also leading a research project on oil and gas in a global perspective. And then I'm the director of a research center for energy ethics.
Thank you, Mette. Mitchell.
So I live in Southwest New Hampshire in the hill country of what we call the Monadnock region, about 1,200 feet. There's still snow on the ground. I've had a long career in environmental studies. Much of it was at Antioch, New England Graduate School, where I founded a suite of master's and PhD programs. Then I was president of a small university in Maine called Unity College, where we focused on building a sustainable campus. And I've written a bunch of books along the way. Currently, I'm independent, and mostly I think, I write, I hike, I play music, and I try to get involved and engaged in any interesting intellectual or practical activities that serve communities.
Oh yeah, there are multiple.
Just touch upon a few, okay? Just
on a few, okay.
Ones.
An important one for me was when I was in my early 20s, and I was working for an NGO in the Ecuadorian rainforest. And a big part of my job was with communities affected by the production of oil. And what I saw in my work shocked me. So I was born and raised in Denmark. Denmark's national economy relies, and a big part of it was, at least when I was a kid, coming from oil and gas that were in the North Sea. And the oil and gas production in Denmark was offshore. And as such, for me as a kid, it was out of sight, out of mind. I didn't think about it. I honestly did not contemplate where the energy that we relied on came from. I took it for granted. And when I was in Ecuador, it was this really sudden, stark realization that this is also how it gets produced. The situation in Ecuador was particularly difficult because of the national regime that was in place in Ecuador, the difficulty of governance, stark inequalities, difficulties of access, etc. So what I remember when I would come home from my work in Ecuador, come back to Denmark and be reunited with my parents and my brother. My brother at the time worked as a geophysicist for a big oil and gas drilling company, and he was coming back from Nigeria. So it was some very intense conversations that would happen at our dinner table, because I came back from Ecuador, where local communities were struggling to make a living, and my brother was coming back from Nigeria, where he worked and was making a very good living. So it was a turning point for me, both my work in Ecuador, but then also bringing it together into the family realm of conversations over dinner.
I could imagine some quite tense conversation over the kitchen table here, right?
Very much so. It was not exactly, I think, what my parents had hoped for.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I would also, if it's okay for me to share another turning point,
Sure.
I would like to do so, because what that did for me was it kind of set in motion an awareness about, how is energy being produced, and eventually gave rise to the research that I'm now doing. So I now do fieldwork in the state of Colorado, and there was a particular moment in my fieldwork that has also been a turning point. And that was when I was in the part of Colorado where a lot of oil and gas is being produced. A rancher, third generation rancher on the family farm, has opened up his land to more than 600 oil and gas wells. So I asked if I could meet with him, because I was so interested in, like, a third generation rancher, working the family land, willingly opening up the land to oil and gas drilling. If you think about the experiences that I had in Ecuador, the assumption that I arrived with when I knocked on his door, they were not positive. They were not optimistic. I was thinking about what was happening to the land. When I met with him, it was so interesting, because he said to me that for him, the only way in which he would allow oil and gas drilling on his land was by doing it himself. And that was how he would protect his land, because he was not against oil and gas drilling, but he was against the way that it was done in places like Ecuador. So what he did was that he and his son together opened up 5 companies, and they insisted that oil and gas drilling could only happen if the companies would let him and his son basically take driver's seat on as many operations as possible. And so that for me was a really important encounter, teaching me not to judge, teaching me to be respectful and patient and engage in dialogue. Mm-hmm. So that is another turning point that opened my eyes to how we make sense of energy.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you asked the question. The next book I'm planning is a memoir of moments of awakening, learning moments from early childhood through adulthood that really changed the way I see the world. And I hadn't thought of these two before you asked the question. But here are two. One I'm going to just mention briefly, and the other I'll go into in a little more detail. The first was when I was 4 years old, and we lived in an apartment in Queens, New York. There were 2 consecutive hurricanes. One of them was Hurricane Hazel. I don't remember the name of the other one. And I was, as a little boy, but I was absolutely amazed at the power and fury of nature. So that, in a way, is my exposure to energy unleashed, non-anthropocentric energy, if you will. And I'll never forget the eye of the storm. When the eye of the storm came, we thought we can go outside, and my mother said, "No, you really we can't do that." And then it came back again, this incredible power. So there could be this calm in between this unleashed fury, which of course was, all this atmospheric circulation churning up the energy of the biosphere, which I now know in retrospect. The second really important example was, I don't remember how old I was. I was probably 9, 10, 11 years old, somewhere there. We had a power blackout throughout all of the Northeast. And I'd never experienced anything like that. There was a major failure at a grid somewhere near Niagara Falls. And New York City and the New York metropolitan area and many places in the Northeast were without power for a significant period of time. And that was another amazing experience, because, like Mette, I had never really thought about, turning the lights on or being warm or any of those kinds of things. There was no reason to. But this alerted me to the very complex, again, I'm doing this in retrospect. I'm not sure I would have used these words when I was 10, but it's alerted me to the extremely complex infrastructure that surrounded my life, and how tentative it was and how ephemeral it was. The notion of impermanence in relationship to energy struck me at the time. Yeah. So this, again, I haven't thought about that in a really long time. But later on, many years later, when I began teaching, one of my favorite activities was this. I would hold up a marking pen, a magic marker is what we called them. And I always ask folks in the class to tell me everything you can about this commodity, where it comes from and where it goes. And I would give them newsprint and many other markers and have them draw it. I'd have them work in groups of 4 to 5 and do this. The really amazing thing was that no one ever knew. They couldn't, it was entirely abstract. One time I had an organic chemist who actually knew the exact process involved, but what it did, it taught the fact that this is a global chain of commodity transformation, which I would then call the ecological economic pathway of essentially of energy transformation. So how this, is derived from petrochemicals, and that expands your notion of space and time. So that became a very important pedagogical approach for me. How can I take aspects of everyday life and expand them so that it challenges students' notion of spatial and temporal variation in relationship to the biosphere? Not necessarily energy in particular, but you can't escape thinking about energy in that regard.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
And that all came back from the magic mark, from the blackout, because it's the same sense. Well, when you turn, and then I'd ask the question in class, well, what happens when you turn the switch? And why is it that you really only think about energy when you don't have it? I think that was the important question, of course. And as Mette suggests previously, that brings us into questions of justice and equity and a whole range of different phenomena as well, when you think about access and lack of access to it.
Yeah.
But that whole switch question enables you to begin to perceive infrastructure in different kinds of ways.
Yeah. And before, so we've been touching upon your very private, personal, sense-making moments that hold meaning or held meaning for you. And of course, there's this whole other very abstract level of ethics and, huge infrastructures and world-changing transitions and stuff. But there is a middle ground as well. And I've been looking forward to ask this question for at least 2 weeks now since I listened to the podcast, Mette, and it inspired me to ask you this. And it's something I think you can both answer quite well. I learned from this podcast, which is impressive. I really recommend it. You have been doing research as a social anthropologist in Mongolia through the times of a gold rush involving Buddhist monks. I'm learning you have been observing the daily lives on oil rigs, right? Mm-hmm. You have been in those executive corporate boardrooms that are usually totally closed to outsiders, and you have been seeing the sense-making taking place on energy behind those doors. So, wow, what a diverse insight you got. So, and Mitchell, you have been, teaching, I don't know, it must be hundreds and hundreds of students. You have been hearing feedbacks from people from indigenous nations in Alaska. You have been hearing as an activist, as a leader of a renowned college, solar panels going back to the White House, amazing stories here. So what I'm asking you here is, what have you learned about energy and sense making in such diverse patterns? And what I'm trying to get to is, do you believe there are any cross-cultural patterns beyond cultures and sectors that connect the sense making happening in such diverse settings? Any ideas on that?
Mette, why don't you lead on this?
Should I go first? The thing that has struck me in my work, whether it is Mongolia or it is the US, is the relationship between how we make sense of energy and how we make sense of people. Mm-hmm. And
so how do we do that?
Yeah, so what I'm noticing is a tendency in these very different locations to surround ourselves with people who have similar views of the world, of energy and of people. And that kind of goes back to what you were mentioning earlier about silos, the forming of echo chambers. I feel that when it comes to questions of energy and how it is we make sense of other people, we prefer, it seems, and I think this is very sad, we prefer to engage in conversations with people who view the world in a similar way. And as such, the conversations really become monologues. They become affirmations of our own worldviews. And when that happens, again and again, it doesn't matter whether it's the boardrooms or it's environmental activists, when we are isolating ourselves with people who share views similar to our own, when we suddenly step outside our comfort zones and are confronted with other people, it becomes a clash, it becomes a conflict, and it becomes something that I think many people fear, something many people see as unwanted and undesirable. And I think that's a real hindrance, actually, to our understanding, not only of energy, but also of the world and ourselves.
All right.
Yeah,
Mitchell.
yeah, that was a really wonderful elaboration, and it sparks a lot of thoughts for me. I'm going to start with, I actually numbered these in order, but I'm going to start in the reverse order. I think that the concept that you're expressing is the idea that we mostly hang out in self-similar networks. And there's a lot of social network analysis that's been done, which suggests that people tend to engage in what are called homological networks. That is, people who are like-minded. We see this on Facebook, we see this with social media, we see this all the time. But in fact, really creative and innovative individuals and organizations wind up being nodes in networks, nodes that connect different networks, which is exactly what you're doing, Mette. You know, so you're serving as a node that's connecting a variety of networks. So you become the person who is trusted, although you may not be really a part of either network. And there's a very special sort of individual who's able to do that. But learning how to do that's not taught. You were probably never taught how to do that. I mean, there might have been research methodologies that suggested it, but that's not enough. This is something that's intrinsic to who you are as an individual. Excuse my presumption here, because I don't really know you, but that's what I'm suspecting. And then because you're able to do that well, you're called upon to do it more often. So this whole question of networks is very interesting in that regard. But and what I do in my new book, To Know the World, a new vision for environmental learning, is there's a chapter called Constructive Connectivity, in which I look at the parallel between ecological and social networks. There's the template for thinking about networks is in the ecosystem, it's in the biosphere, because we're surrounded by these extraordinary ecological infrastructures that we barely understand. I mean, compare the number of, the mycelium is the perfect example in the forest, where all this information and exchange and energy transfer is taking place with great rapidity and in ways that we barely understand. And compare the number of mycelium researchers to bankers and lawyers. You know, you can't even scale it, really, yet it's such a fundamental part of how we think about, or how we ought to be thinking about it. So what I try to do is show the linkages between understanding ecological networks and also understanding social networks. There's a lot more to say about that, but I won't right now.
Mitchell, I'm also thinking about another chapter that you, in a book that you wrote already, and that fascinated me as well, is perceiving energy. So I'm just saying, maybe you can touch on that briefly as well.
Yeah, well, that's the 9 elements of the sustainable campus has a chapter on energy. I'll get to that in a second, but there are a couple of other points I wanted to make here, especially in terms of traveling and being with people and the language that we use. You know, so often we say, I don't have very good energy today. You know, or I have great energy. Well, what does that really mean? What are we suggesting when we say that? There's something about our vitality. And we use this, you know, we use this notion of energy to express our vitality. Yet it's rare that you would see someone find a parallel use of the term when thinking about, let's say, carbon emissions. So we use energy when we think about carbon emissions, and we use energy when we think about our personal vitality at any given moment of time. And I've found in all, one of the projects that I was involved in, Mette, that you may not be aware of, several years ago, I wrote a short book on multicultural and multi-generational sustainability projects throughout the Pacific Northwest, in rural communities and in urban communities. In fact, so I was in rural Alaska, I was in rural Montana, working with ranchers, by the way, and just getting a sense of how they were able to build long-term sustainable projects by working with diverse groups of people. So we have a lot to share in that regard. But I would find that by listening well, I would find the point of resonance or the energy wavelength, if I don't want to sound new age here, but there is kind of an energy wavelength that emerges when you find a resonance through good listening. There's a harmony, if you will. Maybe my musician life comes into play here. So I think that's another aspect of this, is that there are resonances that take place through language, through culture, through spirit, if you will, where we're able to communicate with other people in a way because we're on the same energy wavelength. Finally, the last thing I wanted to say about all of this is there's tremendous symbolism involved in energy as well. So when I was president of Unity College, we had the Jimmy Carter solar panels. When Jimmy Carter was president, he had solar panels put on the White House. Reagan took them down. Some enterprising individual from the college, which I arrived at much, much later, was able to get those solar panels, and they were on our cafeteria, a small, it was a very small college. So when I was president, having the Jimmy Carter solar panels was my best promotional currency for our college, because everyone wanted one. This was 2006, between 2006 and 2011. So we used those solar panels as a symbolic representation of what our college could be doing and what the whole world could be doing. So there was a Chinese solar energy entrepreneur who wanted one of those solar panels. So we sent him one, and we wound up going to China. There were just so many different individuals who wanted these things. And at every opportunity, I would use the symbology of it to promote how we think about renewable energy and sustainability. So just in the conclusion, we cover networks and network learning. We cover language and how we express how we feel. We cover the resonance between people and the ability to connect different groups of people through that kind of resonance. And we cover the symbolism of using energy artifacts, let's say, as a way of communicating important learning objectives.
Is it okay if I add a little thing to this list?
Sure, please.
Because Mitchell, you were just bringing up things like music, right? And so one of the things that I'm doing with the Center for Energy Ethics is to incorporate the arts, because I think the arts are crucial in facilitating dialogue and facilitating conversations, bringing people together and create an environment where there's no right or wrong. When I was talking about these kind of echo chambers, the thing that happens is that people can become convinced that they're right and that others who hold different views are wrong, and it becomes this very simplistic for or against, bifurcated universe. And what I personally love about the arts is there's no right or wrong. It's the same with music, right? It's an experience and it's an engagement. And I can experience a painting in the way that I do, and you can experience a painting the way you do. And we're equally entitled to our experiences. And so I think the arts, here including music, they offer a really powerful tool to bring us together in a way where we've moved so far away from right or wrong.
Yes, I'd like to add to that. And again, it's really self-promotional, but I wrote another book called Bringing the Biosphere Home, which is about learning to perceive global environmental change. And I spend a lot of time in that book talking about imagination as a way to perceive scale. And that's the other thing that the arts do. So you could hear a piece of music, or you could look at a painting or a photograph, or just a whole variety of multimedia approaches, voices, venues, and suddenly you can juxtapose really big concepts in ways that you never could through the written word. So I think the other aspect of art, bring people together in the ways you suggest, the other aspect of it as a learning potential is that it enables you to really, to come up with really big concepts on your own, just by being stimulated, the imagination being stimulated by the art project itself.
I think to open the conversation on that topic, I'll bring up an example again from Mongolia. So when I went to Mongolia to do my field work as an anthropologist on the gold rush that was happening there at the time, I came with an idea that I was going to study, to explore the gold rush as an economic phenomenon in an area that where most of the population is nomadic. What does it mean when you suddenly have this massive gold rush taking place? People are moving to the gold rush areas, settling in mining camps, following a very different seasonal schedule than they would otherwise have done with the herds. So I approached it very much as an economic phenomenon. And what I realized very quickly in my fieldwork was, if I looked at the extraction of gold in Mongolia simply as an economic phenomenon, I would misunderstand it. I would fundamentally misunderstand what kind of phenomenon it was to Mongolian herders who were now involved in the gold mining. So in my fieldwork in Mongolia, we do what we call participant observation. And so, I had to participate. And so I spent 2 years in the mountains of Mongolia working on a mining team. And the people I was working with on my team were very worried about accidents. Accidents happened all the time. And the accidents were often seen as a manifestation of spirit anger, as spirits of the ground, as spirits of the water, as spirits, guardian spirits that curled around the gold nuggets. And so when the spirits got angry with our actions, they would take kind of almost like revenge. And the revenge would manifest itself in things like accidents. And so the daily life in the gold mines was formed through a cosmological appreciation of the existence of spirits. And that was what was shaping really everything about the gold rush, the way it was done, how it was done, with whom it was done, when it was done. And I remember, so I've also worked for the UN in Mongolia, and I remember, so many of these meetings within the United Nations, looking at things like the Mongolian gold rush and approaching it purely in economic terms. How much gold is being produced? What is the value of that gold? Which markets is the gold being sold at, etc. But when you reduce a phenomenon like the Mongolian gold rush to a purely economic phenomenon, you don't understand really what it means to local people, and then to how it evolves as a phenomenon. So in my work, that was where it really hit me, how I had to look at it in a much broader way. And so in my book, Fear and Fortune, I propose the term of cosmoeconomy, really bringing together cosmology with economic life. The way that I think of it, for example, now with my work in Colorado, is you can put on almost like the filter that will allow you to distill just kind of like a purely economic perspective of, say, oil and gas. You could also remove that filter, allowing you to see it as a cosmoeconomy. What is a cosmoeconomy of oil and gas in Colorado? That's a very different perspective. And that perspective is one that I feel invites us to think of energy in a much more profound and maybe unexpected way.
The term natural resources emerges out of commodity capitalism as a rationale to exploit people, landscapes, and species. It's really simple as that. I don't want to sound overly ideological, but that's what the term, I mean, you know, we're dealing with a 500-year legacy of European expansion and colonization. And that's where the term, you know, natural resources emerges within that paradigm. And so it becomes a rationale. That rationale leads to boom and bust cycles. You see boom, when you have rapid transformation of landscapes for the purposes of energy procurement or metal procurement, typically you're going to have a boom and bust cycle. And that dramatically changes communities. The American West is a fantastic example. Well, just about any place in North America is really a great example of boom and bust cycles that communities have to somehow find ways of responding to. So that's one aspect of you know, how I think about natural resources. But then getting back, I think, to also some of the things that Mette was getting at, the relationship between indigenous knowledge and environmental learning yields a very rich notion of what we mean by our relationship with nature that doesn't necessarily look at exploitation of the resources, of natural resources, as the primary activity. That's not to say that indigenous cultures don't often overexploit. I don't want to romanticize any of this by any stretch of the imagination. But what we find is that in mostly all of these cultures, there's language that's now lost, by the way, that expresses notions of cosmology, notions of ecology and nature, notions of the relationship between the spirit world of animals and the spirit world of humans. That's all embedded in ritual and language. So it's a completely different way of thinking about energy. Energy comes from a variety of different sources. There's been, over the last several decades, both, you know, academic and non-academic interest in learning from these traditions, so we have a better sense of how to deal with all these questions. So the notion of the relationship between cosmology and energy, or cosmology and economics, broadly speaking, brings us back to these traditions, which had quite a bit of wisdom in that regard. Again, without romanticizing some of the, you know, some of the challenges that they faced and some of the exploitation that they were involved in. So those are my comments. You know, the issue of literacy is it may be overrated in some regard. I don't think that's what the issue is. The issue is access right now. That's what we see. I can only speak from, you know, an American perspective, but the issue in America is access. You know, we've come out of a period of what I describe as hideous corruption, a period of the revival of the darkest traditions in American life, racism, colonization. And it's an awakening that's taking place. And it's an awakening that's taking place in communities of color that are demanding access. And one of the most important things they're demanding is access to energy, if you will. That when you talk about inclusion and participation, you're talking about access to means of thinking about energy as much as you are anything else. So when I look at the future, and I'm very hopeful, because I think that it's about time that questions of human nature relationships and questions of equity and race and inclusion are all linked together. You know, that is the transcendent issue of our times, in my view. So where does energy relate to that? Everywhere. You can see it any way you want to. But the most important way to get to it is the access question. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's what's on people's minds right now. And that's where the learning needs to take place. And that's where public policy needs to take place. Mm-hmm. I'm so delighted to see what this administration is doing thus far in terms of questions of access. The people they're putting into power who understand this, moving forward on it.
I mean, I think my view on this question of energy literacy and what we can do. I think for me, it's about empathy. And I really mean that, like, what we need before, we need to know, you know, like you're talking about, you know, how is energy being produced, you know, what are the implications of different forms of production, distribution chains, etc. But I think really, most importantly, we need to develop a mindset that is empathetic, where we relate to each other as fellow human beings and residents on the earth. And it doesn't matter whether you're a CEO or you live in the slums. We are all human beings. We need to relate to one another. And it goes for both parties. And if you can get those two parties so structurally differently positioned in society to truly listen to each other and care for each other, right? That's when we can create incredible energy systems. And I really believe in it. And so what is my role? I see my role really as one of facilitation. I see my role as one of bringing parties together and having tough conversations, having tough debates. They're not easy, but having these debates, I think, are necessary, where people come together and they try their hardest to develop an empathetic attitude. Then I think we can make change. Right now, at least here in Scotland, what we are seeing is that the population, when it comes to energy policy, the population is ahead of the government. The population here is pushing for change, but we are having a government, both in Scotland and in Westminster in the UK, that they're more conservative than the people. And so we need, you know, I'm really glad that Mitchell, he brings up public policy. We need public policy to shift, to move, and to develop, I think, that much more future-oriented, more daring, and hopefully more empathetic attitude that we are seeing in the population. I'm an eternal optimist. I believe it requires a lot of self-reflexivity and a willingness to engage. But I do believe it's possible.
It's an exploratory language. It's a language of the imagination. It's a language of politics. It's a compassion, and it's a language of empathy, a language of compassion, a language of practice, of exploration. We're on the verge of some very interesting change. I'm very excited and optimistic about that.
I want to thank you for taking your time and be here fully present as human beings and not just as experts in one field.